This episode is sponsored by Hello Honeydew, a leading free utilities concierge service. Hello Honeydew is a free service designed to relieve the stress of a moving house, and it saves you time, money, and headaches on all your essential home service needs. We will hook up your gas, electricity, internet, TV, water, and home security systems in just one 15 to 20-minute phone call. You will also receive a free Amazon Echo Dot just for setting up an appointment. If you have closed on a house and have received your closing date, call us now for a free appointment and a free Amazon Echo Dot at 732-859-2019 and visit us at hellohoneydew.com for more information. From the studios in beautiful Oceanport, New Jersey, welcome to the biggest and greatest podcast ever. I'm your host, Ray K. In a packed 40-year career, Glenn Rifkin has 30 years been a contributing writer for the New York Times business section, Harvard Business School founding writer for Forbes ASAP, and get this, a best-selling author of Radical Marketing from Harvard to Harley. Lessons from, 10 that broke the rules and made it big. Right now, Glenn is an author of a tremendous book that I'm in the process of reading. It's one of those turn pagers. It's called Future Forward. And let me just read this here. Patrick McGovern was a gift to us all. It goes on and on and on about this man that is just an amazing person. I've known Glenn on Facebook for, I guess, about a year from another friend of mine that I was honored to, have Glenn, accept my request. So we've been going back and forth on Facebook. He's honored to be my guest. I'm live with Glenn. Glenn, let's get right to it. Tell us about Patrick McGovern and how you got involved with him.
Sure. I had taken a job with the company IDG in 1983. So we're talking way back at the beginning of the personal computer revolution. I didn't know a computer from a washing machine. It was just a chance to get a writer's job at a publication, Computer World, that I had never heard of, but it turned out to be the Bible of the technology industry. When I went there, they were printing issues that were the size of the Manhattan phone book, and I thought, wow, this is more exciting than I anticipated. And you couldn't work there very long without hearing the name of the chairman and founder, Patrick McGovern. He was sort of a bigger-than-life legendary figure within the company. Employees were, in awe of this guy because he had built this incredible media empire around the world. And in those days, the growth was just off the charts. And he just got on my radar screen then, and it was...
You knew of him, Glenn, before then, or was it when you started working there you knew about him, or did you know about him just, 5 years before, or just...
I had never heard of him. Okay. And honestly, when you think about this book and you think about the story of this man's life and legacy, if you ask 10 people on the street, even technology-savvy people, they probably wouldn't have heard of him because he wasn't a spotlight kind of guy, which is one of the drivers for doing the book, because he was a pioneer in the industry, a key industry figure, and yet, unlike Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and those folks, he wasn't looking for that kind of attention. He was focused on the company, on the success of the company, the success of the employees. So I had never heard of him, but boy, once you worked there, you heard of him. And one story that you may have been planning to ask me, but I could bring up now, is the most famous story was that around Christmas time, the word got out that Pat was coming to the building. And, when I first heard of this, I thought, what is this all about? Well, sure enough, McGovern made sure that he went to every desk of every employee of every office in the United States, which we're talking about 5,000 people at the time. And he would stop at your desk. He knew you by name. He would ask your manager, if he didn't know you, to tell him a little bit about you so he could have something to talk about. He would congratulate you on the fine job you were doing. He would thank you for the contributions to the company. And then he would hand you an envelope with a bonus, generally filled with $100 bills. And you can only imagine that this left a pretty big impression on every single employee of that company. And to this day, when I was interviewing literally dozens and dozens of people for this book, that was the story that almost every one of them told me, because that really made an impression that lasted a lifetime, and that's the kind of leader he was.
How much was the bonus, Glenn, if you don't mind me asking?
So when I first started, the bonus was a month's salary, and for a blue-collar journalist, just barely able to pay the rent. That was significant, and and a surprise, because I had no idea something like that was coming. As the company got bigger, the bonus went down a little bit, so it was like $500 in 5 crisp $100 bills, and that may not sound like much if you're an investment banker on Wall Street. It's a joke, but for people working at a company like this during the 1980s, at that time, it was just very meaningful. It was enough money to make a difference and to make you think this guy went out of his way to show that he really cared about the employees, and that was a major contributing factor to the company's success. And
they were crisp too. They weren't like old wrinkled ones,
Well, the word was, the Brinks truck used to come to the buildings, because we're talking about thousands of employees. That was a lot of cash to be running around with. So yes, they were all crisp new $100 bills, as I recall. And it wouldn't have mattered if they weren't, but it was right. the whole concept of it. And who knew of a CEO that did anything like this? Most of us worked at companies where at the holidays, if you were lucky, you got a notice pinned to the bulletin board in the lunchroom from the CEO saying "good job," and maybe there was a turkey given out or something. But money and bonuses to companies like that, it was kind of unheard of.
And that sort of was his thing, as I'm reading the book, the in-person visit, the 300,000 miles a year. I went to Ireland 6 times a year to visit my son, and that was 30,000. So that's like going to Ireland once a week, to put it in those kind of terms, that's every year. It's almost mind-boggling. And the importance, as I call it, running out the ground ball, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
I like that phrase. There was never a ground ball that he didn't run out, because he just believed deeply in meeting people face to face. And if you were going to have a global business, you had to get your boots on and get on the plane and go. Right. He was on planes, as you just said, 300,000 miles a year. He never was home. He basically lived in the Ritz Hotel in Boston, which was, whenever he was in town, he was there so infrequently that he just stayed in a hotel. He had his own suite. And it was, easy to get to the office from there, and then easy enough to get back to the airport to get on another plane. So that was his mode of management and his leadership style. The book takes a look at 10 of the leadership lessons that he really imparted during his 50 years running the company, which is a remarkable thing just on its own right.
Well, lesson 10, love your employees, adore your customers. That has to get your attention. You experienced that firsthand. One question comes to mind, though, as you're saying that. He's traveled to China, all the stories, the world. He's building this thing up to billion-dollar company. Did he have a family life? There's always something that suffers. Did that come into play at all, or how did that affect things for him? There is that side.
Well, here's the backstory on that. This book happened because his son came to me he wanted a book written about his father. Pat McGovern died in 2014, so your listeners have a sense of what we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. And a couple of years later, his son came to me, Patrick McGovern III, and wanted a book done because he felt like his father's legacy deserved a book. So when we talked, we became very close during this process, and we talked about that very issue. What effect did it have? And like many really successful entrepreneurs, this guy was married to his business. The company was his number one priority. And how did that affect his family life? Decided not to really make that a part of the book because it's about leadership lessons. Right. But mm-hmm. it certainly had an effect. He didn't spend a lot of time at home. He made sure his 2 children knew that he loved them and that he was there for them if they needed him. But he was a guy who was, out on the road. He was running a company, and like a lot of these very successful people, something has to give. You can't really do it all like that. And in those days, especially in the 60s when he started this, the husband was out doing a job and the wife stayed home with the kids, and it was that type of mindset. But, in terms of his family, he was very devoted to his family in his own way of doing that. And, to me, he made it a success because both his children, who I know well, really loved him and revered him. So, whatever they didn't get, they got a lot anyway. And so he was not a completely absentee father who just ignored his children. That would not be a fair characterization.
Right. Okay. Absolutely understand that, and I appreciate you bringing that up because you always wonder, like the Steve Jobs, these guys that are dedicated. There is that little price on the end, but in the end, it sounds like it came out fine because of the the devotion of the children, which is which is nice to hear.
No question.
Yeah,
no question.
Yeah.
And,
one of the things I found interesting is the when he went to China without that visa. I mean, if you could explain that to me, that shows some kind of gumption, or I don't know what the word is. Maybe you could tell me the word. You're a writer. That's a great story to actually go to China with no visa. Can you talk about that story?
Sure, absolutely. That's a key story in the book. In fact, I probably could have written a whole book just about his business dealings in China. Pat was a risk taker. You're a great entrepreneur. You have to have risk in your blood. A lot of us don't, and this guy just saw the world as an opportunity in ways that others didn't. So he was on a trip to Japan in 1978, and he had it in mind that China was a sleeping giant, that there would be an opportunity there, but he needed to see it to understand what was going on there. So he was flying from Tokyo to Moscow, and the flight was making a stop in Beijing, in which nobody was allowed to get off the plane because Beijing and China had no diplomatic relationship at that time with the United States. It was just coming out of the Mao era, and Pat didn't care, and he figured out a way that he could get off the plane in Beijing, talk his way into the city. Now, you have to understand, he didn't speak Chinese, and these folks didn't speak English at the airport. But somehow he communicated to them that he needed to get into the city, and these guys were befuddled, and this guy was a 6'3", 250-pound linebacker type of guy, an American businessman in his dark business suit. And they somehow granted him a day pass to go into Beijing. They said, don't tell anybody we gave you this. And here's this guy walking around the streets of Beijing at a time when, people are still wearing those drab gray Mao hats and clothes. They must have looked at him like he had just landed from Mars. And he wandered around for the day. He went into bookstores. He went into shops to see what it was that was of interest to people. And in the bookstores, he saw people lined up, just dying to get their hands on whatever newspapers were there, whatever books they could get to, because they had been living in a repressive regime that kept information away from them. And the light bulb went on for him, and he said, I need to come back to this place because there's an opportunity here. So 2 years later, and by the way, Deng Xiaoping became the premier of China during this time. He opened diplomatic relations with the West. He decided that China, its only chance for a future was to have a market economy. So a new era was beginning. And in 1980, 2 years later, McGovern went back, and he worked out a joint agreement with the Ministry of Technology. And by October of 1980, the first issue of China Computer World was published. And no other Western publisher was doing business in China then. And he got the first mover advantage and built IDG China into a massive success. To this day, it's the biggest publishing company. And, at its peak, Computer World China was selling more copies than the People's Daily. And, we're talking about a population now of 1.3 billion people. And IDG is well entrenched there. And this was all because he was willing to say, I see an opportunity. I see a group of people who are starving for knowledge. And that was his method for going behind the Iron Curtain, starting publications in Hungary and Poland, the Soviet Union, all of these places, before anyone else would do it. It was a remarkable feat of determination and vision by him.
And thus the title of your book, right? I mean, we're looking moving forward. It's the future. I mean, that seems like it's like a life, that title. One other thing that stuck out, Glenn, is this quote: "If you listen to what people want, I mean, it sounds like it's common sense, but sometimes the common sense is the wisdom. If you listen to what people want and respond accordingly, you will do very well." Can you explain what that means?
Well, he started his company in 1964 when he was working for a computer magazine that was based in Newton, Massachusetts. Pat had been a recent graduate of MIT, so he was in the area. And he was sent down, he was sent down on a trip to New York to report for the magazine, and he met the chairman and CEO of a company called Univac, which your older listeners will know was a big computer player, one of the first. And he sat in the office with this guy, and they started talking about what these computer companies were doing. And at the time, all there were in the world were mainframes. This is 1964, so there were no personal computers. There were mainframes. They were multi-million-dollar machines that filled a room. And their engineers and their developers were putting out all of these products that nobody wanted. They were just throwing these things out in the marketplace. And McGovern was, being a very bright guy, was just stifled by this. He said to the head of Univac, why is this going on? Why are your companies putting out products that don't sell because nobody wants them? And the CEO said, you're absolutely right. And part of the problem is we don't have access to the research and information because this business is so new to actually know what people do want. So the light bulb again went on for McGovern. And he said, well, what if I started a newsletter that looked at the whole information technology industry from both a customer's point of view and a vendor's point of view? And we could do surveys, and we could find out what people are using, what people want. And that's exactly what he did. And that started the company in 1964 called IDC, which was the research arm of the company. That came first. Mm-hmm. And so what he learned from that was, if you give people what they need and what they want, as opposed to throwing things out in the marketplace and hoping an audience develops, you're probably going to do a lot better. And that proved to be the case for him. And if you look at, the most successful tech companies, that's been the formula that has worked for them. The ones who have tried to push new ideas that really have no basis in a market, they fail. And, the roadside is littered with good intentions and bad execution.
Right. This one, too, really struck me. The higher the price, the more the demand. I mean, it always seemed like if you pay higher, you think the quality's higher. I don't know if it's a human psychological thing. I fall into that, too. And it does seem to be true, though. I mean, that's the case with Patrick also, correct?
Yeah. I mean, that was the same meeting he had with that Univac CEO mm-hmm. when they started discussing the idea of McGovern putting out a report about the industry. He said, yeah, I could charge like $12,000 or some number like that. And the CEO said, no, that's crazy. And McGovern thought that it was too high. He said, well, I could probably get it lower if I hired some high school students to help me. And the guy said, no, Pat, you're not listening. What you need to do is charge a lot more so that it has a credibility for these companies. They won't buy it. If it's so low priced, it'll seem like it's just worthless information. If you put a high enough price tag on it, it will have cachet. And McGovern, of course, as a businessman, you got to love that formula. Charge more and people will like it more. So it worked.
He jumped on that. Right. You mentioned also with these great leaders. I mean, there are, great leaders around the world. I mean, Patrick is probably, in the upper echelon. Jobs, Gates, Buffett, all these guys. I mean, it's a league. It's
right.
It's the
A league.
It's the Patriots. I mean, it's that kind of thing.
Right.
And they all had a little. I guess even Jobs. You hear stories. Maybe a temper, or there was little weaknesses they each had. But you mentioned that Patrick, you mostly had it all. I mean, he had everything combined that makes a great leader. Correct?
I would say that's a pretty accurate way to look at him. He had his failings as well. The IDG was not a flawless company. They made mistakes. They invested in different things that didn't pan out. But, when you looked at him, one of the people I interviewed said, listen, he didn't bat 1,000, but the fact that he came up to bat over and over again and batted well over 500 says it all about him. A lot of people their first failure, tail would go between their legs and they'd slink off. But he was never daunted by a failure. In fact, he just learned from failure. So, in terms of having the whole package, he was like the 5-tool player for sure. He was able to have great leadership skills. He was able to have great people skills, and he had terrific business sense. So, in that sense, he was definitely an all-star.
If he was a baseball player, what would his lifetime batting average be?
Well, I don't think he would have batted 400 like, Ted Williams only did that once. He would have been in the Hall of Fame for sure. He would have been a 3,000 hit, 300-plus hitter for sure, and maybe even more than that. What would have been? I'm sorry. Go on.
What would have been, Glenn, one of his weaknesses? I mean, what would have been a weakness? I mean, all right, Thomas Edison. Everyone takes chances. We know you have to do that, so he fails. That's fine because you got to learn from the failure. But what would a weakness of his be? I mean, is there one that you could say? Oh,
absolutely. There are a few, but I'd say the one that jumps out to me was, he fell in love with his babies. And he would stick with them when all around him would be saying, look, this isn't working anymore. This publication is not really relevant anymore. We're losing audience share and market share. And he wouldn't give it up. He would insist on sticking with it because these were publications that he was involved in starting. And so, holding on too long can sometimes be a bad thing. And he had a tendency to do that here and there, not a lot, but that was one thing that I heard from people, when you would talk about the very same question. Were there things that were weaknesses? And so that was one.
Mm-hmm. I love the cool part about this book is you actually worked for the man. I mean, you know him. There's a lot of books, like Kitty Carlisle for Sinatra. You don't even know if it's true. But with your situation, Glenn, you know the guy. I mean, this is about as authentic as I've ever seen reading the book. You just feel good about it because you know it's true.
Well, the whole reason I felt really good about taking on this book assignment was because I worked there, because I felt that having worked for the company for 7 years, I understood the culture. I had lived the culture, and I got to know him very well. When I stopped working there, the reason I left the company was because I had a chance to start writing for the New York Times, and I felt like, that was a no-brainer. But I always thought the best job that I'd ever had was working there. And Pat and I had become close enough during that time that when I was leaving, he said, would you be willing to keep working for me as a personal ghostwriter's, speechwriter kind of job? And I did that for about 3 years. I kept in touch with him, and we would work together on articles that would have his name on them. So I got to spend some good one-on-one time with him. So yeah, I felt that, having had the insider's view of it made a very big difference. And it gave me a credibility when I would approach people to say, yeah, I know what you're talking about. I was there.
Did you see him throughout the 90s, say? Or sporadically?
I did. I would see him. If you Google it, I can't even honestly say the answer, but I know I wrote articles about him for the New York Times, for Strategy and Business, for a magazine called Briefings that I still write for. So I would write about him because he was such a dynamic figure that there would be opportunities over time to write about him. So we would reconnect, and every time we reconnected, it was just a really wonderful chance to catch up. He would always invite me to meet for breakfast at the Ritz. I live in the Boston area, so it was easy for me to do that. So we had always maintained this connection. And by the way, every time I would see him, I had written many books by then, and that was part of what I did for a living. And I would say to Pat, look, when are we doing your book? And he would laugh, and he would say, I'm not ready yet. There's way too much to do. So the irony and sadness was that, we never got to write that book together. But I feel good that I got to write the book at all because it was a story definitely worth telling.
When was the last time you saw him?
Well, he had been at IDG is one of those companies that people who leave still feel very close to the company. So there's a big alumni population, and somebody organized an IDG reunion in 2013, I'm pretty sure it was, and that was the last time I saw him. Nobody realized how ill he was at the time. So he came to the reunion, and that was when I saw him last and got a chance to talk to him. They set up one of those photo booths inside the hall where we had this event, and he went in there with all these different former employees to have pictures taken, like you would, with your girlfriend. You'd go in and have those shots taken on those strips of film.
On the boardwalk, yeah.
Yeah, and he did that. So I remember I've got a couple of those pictures, and it was a really nice evening. He was in his glory, and people, by the way, it wasn't just me who revered this guy. Everyone who worked for this company loved this guy, and I know this by the reaction to the book and to the reaction I got when I interviewed people for the book. CEOs. They engender a lot in the world. They create, places for people to make a living. They stimulate the economy. But very few of them engender this kind of affection from their employees. But he did. People really loved the guy. He was a game changer in a lot of people's lives, including mine. You talk about his generosity. It wasn't just a Christmas bonus. He started an employee stock plan called an ESOP back when those first were legal to do in the country in the 1980s. And people were given money into this plan, a little bit like a 401k became later, but even more so at IDG. And each year they would make a contribution to your ESOP, so that by the time people who had worked there for 10 or 20 years were leaving, there were a lot of millionaires. Mm-hmm. This is well before the Silicon Valley boom where everybody, got equity in the company, and all these millionaires were formed in the venture world. This was 1980s, and people started to accumulate a certain amount of wealth just because of his generosity, just because he felt like he wanted to share the profits with the employees. And I left there after only 7 years with a significant retirement, my nest egg. And I thought if I had worked at another company, they would have shook my hand, given me maybe a 2-week severance package, and said good luck. And maybe the 2 weeks, maybe not. In this place, I was able to walk away with more than I ever dreamed of. And if I stayed much longer, I would have been a millionaire too. So it's just one of these remarkable stories of generosity that changes people's lives.
So you were almost probably able to retire, but you had enough comfort to explore and take the New York Times job, and you had a little more freedom at that age. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
It wasn't enough to retire. It was not, not crazy money, but it was certainly a lot more significant than I would have ever gotten in any other job. And it's just it speaks volumes about the type of leader he was. Mm-hmm.
Glenn, what does it take to create this book? How long has this thing been in process? What's the process to publish it? I know you have all the connections. I imagine you had a bestseller before. What's the process?
So, as I said, Patrick the Third came to me in the fall of 2016 to discuss the project. Mm-hmm. We agreed on to move forward, and I began working on the book in January of 2017. So that would have meant starting to interview people, to start research, to start gathering all of the pieces that you need to put together to create a full book. And the book was finished, the manuscript was finished in April of 2018. So that's not quite a year and a half. And the book came out this past late September, early October. So it's a long process, mm-hmm. And there, people who think they can write a book in 3 months. I mean, I'm sure you can, but it probably will suffer from, the lack of the kind of hard work that it needs to make a book really work. And so, that was the process. And along the way, it was an amazing experience for me. I went to India, I went to China, I was in Europe, and in order to tell this story, you had to meet the people whose lives were affected by this man and who worked for the company, and that's what I did.
And was that, I would imagine all expenses paid stuff, or is that out of your own pocket, or
No, those were covered. That's part of your arrangement to do something.
Okay.
The expenses were covered for that, but once we landed a publisher, which was McGraw-Hill, which is a pretty reputable publisher, that was a game changer, because then we knew we were going to get a great book published. They would do a good job with it, which they have. On the other side of that, any author will tell you marketing the book is all on me. Mm-hmm. And there's no, unless you're Stephen King or John Grisham, you're on your own in terms of, once the book is out, they'll give you a little bit of help. In the old days, they would assign a very low-level new employee to work with you, and you'd get probably 4 to 6 weeks of backup in terms of press releases, and they'd send books out. But essentially, you have to do all that work yourself, and it's not for the faint of heart, because you have to really press on it. I'm still doing that now, and some of it's fun and rewarding, and some of it's like banging your head against the wall. So,
is it hard to get on the New York Times best, the thing on Sunday that insert the New York Times bestseller list? Is it hard to get in there?
Oh yeah, it's really hard. There's something like I don't know the exact numbers, but you need to be selling something like 10,000 books a week to get on that list. And you look at the different authors that get on there. Some people can not scam their way, but they can manipulate their way onto that list. But it's not necessarily something that most people can do. And it's tough. New York Times is tough. I was never, when this book was coming together, my goal was to create an appropriate legacy for Pat McGovern, and have it a book that I could hold in my hands and proudly show other people, that we would sell a bunch of copies, that we would get some buzz going around it, and then I would be satisfied. And we've already accomplished that. I've already surpassed my expectations for this, and everything now is just kind of gravy. And books, it sounds like a cliche, but they do have a long shelf life, and I intend to be talking about this book for a long time. And every opportunity like this one, it's a lot of fun, and it's just very rewarding.
Out of the 10 lessons, Glenn, I know all of them are probably equally important, probably like having kids. But is there one particular that you really enjoy out of the 10 lessons?
My go-to one when I get asked that question is the lesson, "Let's try it." One of his amazing traits was to tell the people who worked in the company that they had basically carte blanche to try new ideas. And if you went to Pat and said, "I want to start a new magazine," or I have an idea for a new market that we can attack, he would say, "All right, well, write me up a short business plan and let me see it, and we could try it." And the stories that I put in that chapter are great. The one I'll share with you is the For Dummies books, which I'm sure everybody listening would know. They're pretty famous. They began as an IDG business unit, and it was a guy who was a young marketing sort of genius, I would call him, who took a job with IDG when they started to do a book unit, having no idea what kind of books they were going to sell. And the first efforts were terrible, and nobody was buying the books. They were running out of money, and this guy had heard a story from someone at dinner who said his friend had gone into a computer store back when the days of Computerland and CompUSA, and they went to the counter and they said to the guy, "Listen, I need a book to teach me about this MS-DOS operating system that's just come out. I'm a smart guy, but I really don't get this at all. I need something like DOS for Dummies." And somebody heard him say that, and just it stuck with this guy forever. And it hit him one day. He said, "What if we actually did that? What if we put out a For Dummies book?" And he ran the idea around the company a little bit, and people were astonished. "Are you kidding? You can't do that. You're insulting our readers if you call them dummies." And he went to Pat McGovern, who said, "Let's try it." And this is publishing industry history, because DOS for Dummies ended up selling millions of copies, and those black and yellow books that you see in every bookstore, around the world, just took off. And they started off with technology titles, and this young guy thought, well, if we can do this with technology, what if we branched into some non-technology areas? Mm-hmm. So he proposed personal finance for dummies, which was a massive hit. Then he got Ruth Westheimer to do sex for dummies, which sold tens of millions of copies.
I bet, yeah.
And, it was a raging success. This brand that emerged from that was all because McGovern was basically telling people, try something new, go for it.
So the Four Dummies, the Four Dummies is from McGovern. That whole
exactly.
genre.
And by the way,
wow.
in the around 2000, you recall when the dot-com bubble burst and the big recession hit, that unit had overextended itself, so the company had to sell it. And they sold it to Wiley, which is a big publisher, and they're still putting out for Dummies books. So it didn't have staying power with IDG, but it was at IDG that it became the brand that it is today.
Glenn, I want to talk about you for a little bit, if you don't mind. I will give Patrick 35 minutes, maybe a couple for you.
Okay.
But one quick thing, just a 10-second thing on the audio. Is that stressful on your voice? I mean, you're talking 6 or 7 hours to do an audio version of your book. Is that hard to do? It just seems like it would be to me.
It was both fun and a new thing for me, and it was really grueling. I will say it was grueling because you can only talk for so long. And my longest stint, I was in the studio for 6 different days over many, many hours, more than 6 hours. One studio session was 4.5 hours just on its own. And by the end of that, you're pretty much fried, and you don't want to read another word. But it's a real challenge to. I just felt like this is my own book, and nobody's going to bring the passion and knowledge about it to the project better than me. So that's why I sort of pushed to do it myself. I'm not the right person to ask if it worked, because you'd have to find some objective stranger who said, "Yeah, this was great. I really liked listening to him," or his voice drove me crazy and I can't stand it.
Hey,
I don't know.
No, you got a pretty good voice, I got to say. I was listening to a little bit. You still got the New Jersey accent, though. You didn't get the Massachusetts. I'll say that. But you must have.
Well, you can take the boy out of Jersey, but you can't take Jersey out of the boy, right?
Right. When did you? Were you always a writer? I mean, I see on Facebook, I see, when you're in 5th grade. I mean, were you at that young age in 1st grade, were you always the type of kid that could write creatively and that was just a good writer? Was it a natural gift you had, in some way?
Certainly not 1st grade, but I got into writing early, back in this, I'd say I was about 12 or 13 when I discovered poetry. And you have to remember what the times were like then. This was the 60s, and everybody was kind of getting into things like that. So I started writing then, and then I would start writing short stories. And, I pretty much thought of myself as a writer from a young age. So that's, yes, is the answer. When I went off to college thinking I would become a poet, I got, the cold water splashed in my face fast that it was going to be tough to make a living as a poet. So I ended up majoring in journalism. I figured, let me do something practical that I can actually have a job doing, and then I could write my poetry on the side. So that was my philosophy, and I've always been a writer. Yeah, I mean, my whole career now. Graduated in '75 from Boston University, so that's 43 years as a professional writer. And I can't even imagine how I would explain how I've made a living at it, but here I am. So it's not for the faint of heart, let me tell you.
Who was your favorite, writer? I mean, do you have an idol, Robert Frost, or anyone in particular, Ernest Hemingway, or Bill Young from the New York Daily News, or I'm just throwing names out.
Yeah, no, I read those guys. Pete Hamill, when I was growing up for the Post, was an amazing sports writer. I don't know if you remember him.
Yes, yes.
My favorite writer of all time was John Steinbeck, and I would say that still holds today. But that's not. I would never be able to say with a straight face that I ever thought I could emulate him. But he's just a wonderful writer. I was influenced. I graduated from college in '75, so I was smack in that cohort that was so influenced by Woodward and Bernstein, what they did with Watergate, and the focus they put on journalism and the importance of journalism really hit me at the Boston University journalism program. This is a program that's been graduating Pulitzer Prize winners for 50 years, and so it's a top-notch program, and it was just an amazing impetus to say this is a career that can really make a difference in the world. And so, at the same time, I knew it was not a career where you were going to get rich. I mean, if you hit a best-selling book along the way, which I kind of always hoped would happen, but hasn't, that would be good. But you don't do it for that. You can't go into it for the money. You go into it for other reasons. And, I've managed to make a nice living and to feel that I've accomplished a lot doing these kinds of things. And I've written more articles, had more bylines than I could ever count, and so it's been a very satisfying career.
I just read an obituary you wrote about 3 weeks ago. Every once in a while I'll pick up the Times and I'll say, hey, there's Glenn.
Well, that's a great story. I fell into a gig with the Times that I never dreamed of. I don't know if your listeners would be aware that the New York Times writes obituaries for notable people in advance, so that they will have them ready to go when these notable people die.
I always figured that.
Yeah. I mean, there's no way when you see these massive articles written the next day after somebody dies, it would be very difficult to do that just on a deadline. So I got into doing that. The editor had asked me to try it, and I thought, wow, this is grim. Like, I'm telling people, I'm writing about this, you're still here, but when you die, we're going to have this ready. But sure enough, that's how you do it.
Do you do that when they're like 78 or 85 years old, or do you do it even when they're younger, just in case something tragical happens, like a race car driver, or do you wait till they're, like Muhammad Ali, you kind of figured the end was coming in a few years?
Yeah, I don't know that there's a written down formula. The obituary editor is in charge of keeping that pipeline going. I think it's a combination of, are they notable? I would say once people are into their 80s, they become eligible for that list. And if they were younger, it would be because the word was out that they were suffering from a serious illness, and that the Times found out about the illness and said, well, we should probably get this ready. So it's that kind of, those are the criteria that they go on. Somebody in their 60s is not going to get one of these done just because they're notable now. They'll wait because there's so much more to do. What's the point of researching a career that's still in full swing? So they try to hold off as long as they can. But the one that you mentioned, I had done William Goldman, the famous screenwriter who wrote All the President's Men and Butch Cassidy and The Princess Bride, and it was a chance for me to write a little bit about the entertainment industry, and I really enjoyed doing that. And of course, it's sad that the byline has to happen because somebody dies, but that's an article that got read all over the place because he was just so well known and revered in Hollywood. So there's a certain amount of satisfaction getting that byline.
Right. Just a quick segue back to McGovern. You mentioned Watergate. The era of a principled leader, we're in some interesting times now, which I don't want to delve too much into, because that's probably another story. But this principled leadership, it's just reassuring. I know it was in the past. I know it was happening. I'm sure it's all around us now. But people wonder, is that kind of thing still around? And it's just nice to see that there is a such thing as someone that's a principled leader, in the world, it's just a comment I'm making, it was just nice to see that. That's
sure. Yeah, I agree with you. And it's too rare is the problem. They're out there. There's plenty of them out there, but there's just not enough. And certainly in the political climate we're in, not only in this country but around the world, it's a scary time. And you turn to your leaders to take you through these difficult periods. And who are these people? Where are we going to get them? Are they going to come from the world of business? Why not? But it's sometimes difficult to find them. And McGovern was not a political guy, and so I could never imagine him running for office. But that's the type of value system you would like to see in your leader.
Right. Glenn, I'm going to do it's a segment of mine. I do a hit and miss, which I'm going to say something to you, and I'd like you to do the first thing that comes to your mind, whether it's one word or 4 words or a sentence. Okay.
Okay.
Are you ready? Okay. I mean, this is intense, Favorite color?
Favorite color? Blue.
Okay. If you were stranded on a desert island, what music CD would you bring with you?
Oh man, just one? I can only have one.
All right, you could have a couple.
I would have to have something. I'd have to have some Steely Dan and probably the Beatles' White Album. So, Gaucho and the Beatles' White Album. How's that?
Okay, I'll take those. Favorite movie?
Favorite movie? Well, I just mentioned this, and I don't know if it's my all-time favorite, but I just rewatched it. Was The Princess Bride by Goldman. I just love the movie, so I'll go with that one.
Okay. Favorite actor?
Favorite actor? Well, all time. I'm going to say later. I'm going to say, oh wait, I should have said so and so. I always loved Paul Newman and the stuff he did, and today, who would I say today? I love Bryan Cranston. I think he's because I can't imagine this guy who was on Malcolm in the Middle turned out to be this Academy Award-winning, Emmy-winning, Oscar-winning, Tony-winning, brilliant actor. But that's what he's done.
That kid that was Malcolm is this person you're talking about?
No, it was he played the father on Malcolm in the Middle.
Oh, the father guy. The father is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
A lot of people may not remember that, but that's where Bryan Cranston really. Well, he was on Seinfeld also.
He was the goofy father, right?
Yeah, he was the goofy father on Malcolm, and he was the dentist on Seinfeld.
All right, Lou Gehrig.
Fantastic ball player, the Iron Horse.
Boston Red Sox.
World champions, baby.
All right.
My favorite team.
I meant to ask you, you're from New Jersey. I don't know how old you were when you moved, but I mean, were you always a Red Sox fan, or is that like an implanted thing? When you arrive in Boston area, now you like the Red Sox, or is that?
Okay, so I left New Jersey at 18 and never went back. When I settled in Boston, I was not a Red Sox fan. I was a San Francisco Giants fan, and that's a long story that I don't need to get into. But by 1974, the Red Sox started to get really interesting with Fred Lynn and Jim Rice as the Gold Dust Twins. And I just said, boy, this team is going to be fun to watch. So that's when I jumped on the bandwagon, and I've been a diehard ever since. So I think I qualify at this point after 40-plus years as being a true Red Sox fan.
Okay, that would. One thing I will say, I'm a Yankee fan, is that I don't think Carlton Fisk gets his due. You hear the greatest catchers, Johnny Bench, Yogi Berra.
Right.
I mean, Thurman, my guy Munson died early, so he's
right.
not going to be in that. But you don't hear Fisk's name. If you look at his statistics, they're pretty good, the longevity and so forth. So yeah, I'll give my little bump for him. Glenn?
Well, we appreciate that. We loved Pudge up here. He should never have left. So
yeah. Glenn, good luck with the book, Future Forward. It's a page turner. Highly recommend it, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, Glenn.
Thanks a lot. Take care.